This is a very important panel, but before it begins, I do want to make an announcement that everyone should know. We have a change in the schedule for this afternoon and this evening. Donna Edwards, the Congresswoman from Maryland, who is a member of the Space Committee, is going to be speaking here at 4:30. And Nick Cummings, who is an aide to Senator from Florida, Nelson, excuse me, I'm sorry, who is a very pro-space senator, a Democrat, is going to speak then. Lamar Smith had to send his regrets. He couldn't make it this evening. That's why Donna Edwards, who was going to debate him, has been moved to 4:30. However, we do have a representative of the Trump campaign, and in fact, the head of the Tea Party for Space is going to be speaking at 7 o'clock to 7:30 to provide some balance. And then at 7:30, we have, I believe, some extraordinary special guests that you are going to want to see, which will take the political discussion to the highest level. All right, so just wanted to give you advance notice that things have moved, but in fact they have escalated.
Okay, back to the panel. The highest level is relative. Anyway. All right. I would like to first introduce the Right Reverend James Heiser. He is the Bishop of the Evangelical Lutheran Diocese of North America. He also serves as the Dean of Missions of the Augustana Ministerium and is on the faculty of St. Ignatius Lutheran Theological Seminary and is the president of the Center for the Study of Theology and Space Exploration. He is a founding member of the Mars Society and serves on the Society's Board of Directors and Steering Committee. Dr. Heiser?
Thank you, Nicole. Our hope today is to discuss the relationship between our awareness of the cosmos as a concrete reality and the Cosmoi, which every one of us brings to the interpretation of it. In other words, the differences in the conceptual network which exists among human beings in terms of how we look at the universe as a whole, how we understand it. I'm intrigued by the process of comparing the relationship, therefore, in human thought between a study, for example, and the way in which a study is popularly reported. It doesn't matter what field of research is under consideration. The experience is often shockingly similar. You, as a specialist, read, or even worse, write, a study which captures somehow the eye of more popular outlets. And at first, this can seem very gratifying. A broader spectrum of the public, you think, is suddenly in danger of learning something quite interesting in your estimation about a subject concerning which you are passionate. Then it all seems to go wrong. The non-specialists are misunderstanding the findings, applying them in all the wrong ways, leaping to generalizations, and basically making a mess of things. If you think it's frustrating in your field, try being a theologian. But it's not just such that assessments are perceived to be wrong. Sometimes you wonder where they're even coming from. Well, the answer in this situation is that they're coming from an entirely different world, or, well, at least different worldview. And I would say, following up on what Dr. Zubrin was just saying, it certainly explains the difference in various candidates' positions this year in the political realm as well. They really are from different worlds conceptually that allow them to look at the exact same concrete reality and see something quite different. Recently, I came across a published psychological study on the relationship between the concept of awe to religious, the authors maintained, and scientific worldviews. As the study authors note, religious experience has been associated with awe and wonder, and empirical work has shown that manipulations of awe can increase reported religiosity and spirituality. Awe involves an immediate failure to assimilate information into existing mental structures, and accompanying states of uncertainty trigger motivations for explanation and meaning-making. Religious and supernatural frameworks are one means of satisfying these motives, allowing individuals to explain environmental occurrences via the causal power of supernatural agents. But science can also serve as a strong source of meaning and explanation. Indeed, affinity for secular and supernatural explanations for the world share motivational similarities, and if awe increases the general motivation to find order and explanation, then the means through which that is achieved, e.g. belief in supernatural agents or affirming a scientific worldview, could be secondary." End quote. And the study concluded in part, it seems that awe attracts non-theists to scientific explanations to the extent that science is framed as explicitly providing order and explanation, and eschewing the importance of randomness in the process. End quote. This was a conclusion which the authors admit to finding disconcerting, their word. This is the point where theologians and historians step in with a certain air of bemusement because of the axiomatic confusion on the part of the authors. Regardless of one's theism, or lack thereof, day-to-day life in the world is built on the axiomatic acceptance that we live within a cosmos, a philosophical theological concept rooted in the Greek word, cosmos, which is the source of the English cognate. Put in very simple terms, the Greek concept of cosmos means both an order and world. The concepts were inextricably bound up. A cosmos means something ordered, properly an ordered system, or the world. Cosmos thus stood in opposition to chaos, from which, once again, the English cognate is derived, which is understood to be a state of disorder, not entirely dissimilar to the Hebrew formless and void, tohu wabohu. Chaos may have certain appeal to the coffee shop philosopher level of discourse, but rather plays havoc with matters such as crossing the street. Will the oncoming bus continue to hurtle toward me in keeping with the laws which, from the perspective of human techne, are immutable? Or will the bus spontaneously transmogrify into steam or depart from existence altogether? Your theology or philosophy doesn't come into the interpretation of the order within the universe. It is an orderly place, and with the exception of the suicidal or delusional, all human beings are strict adherents to a belief in a cosmos when it comes to hurtling buses and a great number of other circumstances as well. But while nearly all rational human beings believe in a cosmos as opposed to chaos, they often inhabit quite different cosmoi. All such rational creatures have a set of baseline axioms pertaining to the fundamental ordering of their cosmos. These exist below the level of proof, though those who believe in them will maintain that they are either self-evident or will maintain that they have already been proven. These axiomatic assumptions are often culturally ingrained. As one modern philosopher has observed, to understand culture, quote, "we can start with everything which is different from my mind. So in order to try to determine the idea of culture, we have to proceed from the idea of nature and from the idea of the stranger or the other." End the quote. Culture thus arises because of people's estrangement from nature. Culture is a way of defining a domain of reality which provides people with a world of their own when they feel that their ties with natural reality have been broken. Instead of the natural world to which we human beings and all other living beings belong, we now have the world of culture, which is our world as human beings. Such an understanding of culture is essentially one which sets forth credo ut intelligam, I believe so that I may understand, in the words of St. Anselm. Therefore, awe in beholding some aspect of the creation is not, contrary to the psychologists, a danger. It is a wonder which compels. Perceiving the cosmos to be such a universe compels the outward journey, to live, which is to learn. Nearly 150 years ago, Professor J.C. Sharp observed in his book, Culture and Religion, and I quote, "One who really has confidence in truth, truth alike of science, of philosophy, of history, and of faith, will desire to see truth sought and advanced along all the diverse lines in which it is to be found. He may not see the point at which all these lines converge, but he has perfect faith that they do converge, whether he sees it or not. Believe in God and bid all knowledge speed. Sooner or later, the full harmony will reveal itself. The discords and contradictions disappear." And again he wrote, "If there is reason to believe that God himself is the great educator, and that his purpose, in all his dealings with men, it is to educate them for himself, what a new light would be thrown on all the ground over which we have traveled." That's the point. Not only where we have been, but where we may still go. The endeavor itself continues this education. Its telos is not a place, but that love which passes knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. So far, my initial comments.
Thank you. Next up, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Paul Levinson. He is a professor of communication and media studies at Fordham University in New York City. His science fiction novels include The Silk Code, winner of the Locus Award for Best Science Fiction Novel of 1999, Borrowed Tides, The Consciousness Plague, The Pixel Eye, The Plot to Save Socrates, Unburning Alexandria, and Chronica. His nonfiction books, including The Soft Edge, Digital McLuhan, Real Space, Cell Phone, and New Media, have been translated into 12 languages. He appears on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, the Discovery Channel, National Geographic, the History Channel, and NPR. He edited Touching the Face of the Cosmos on the Intersection of Space Travel and Religion with Micheal Waltemathe. Dr. Levinson, you're...
Well, thank you. I hate to interrupt that. It was such a good introduction. But I've been thinking about the space program for a long time, as I'm sure all of you have. And in particular, after the great days and accomplishments of the 1960s, one of the things that I've been thinking about is, why haven't we done more? And, you know, there are many explanations. Richard Nixon maybe is one. But I don't want to get into too much politics. What I did do is examine what the prime motivations for our species have been to get off this earth. And, you know, as most of you know, the first real accomplishments in getting off the earth, beyond the earth, happened in a military situation. So apropos of Michael, who will be talking to you soon, the Germans deserve an enormous amount of credit, even though it was used for bad purposes, for really getting rocketry to the point where it could lift things off this planet. And then that military motive continued after the end of World War II. It continued in the Cold War between the US and the former Soviet Union. And that actually is what bore the fruit of the late 1960s, where you have somebody walking on the moon. And actually, you have more than somebody walking on the moon. You have more than one human being walking on the moon. And then it pretty much stopped. Obviously, we've gone out into space. We obviously have a robust program in many ways. But back in 1969, if somebody had asked me where we would be in 2016, I would have said, hey, we'd have people walking on Mars, we'd have people around Venus. Some of you may have seen the story that just came out yesterday about Europa, a very exciting series of photographs, but no people are out there. And that's because as far as we've gotten with people in space happened in 1969 and in the few years after. So why did that happen, aside from the political issues? And I'll just mention that, unfortunately, democracy, although I'm strongly in favor of it for just about all things, is not a very reliable platform for lifting us off this planet. Because when you have people in Congress constantly bickering about funding, obviously space travel can suffer. And in addition to that, the Cold War was over by 1990, And even before then, since we had gotten to the moon already, we'd beaten the Soviets, that motive was gone. Well, there was and still is a scientific motive, right? We want to get as much knowledge as possible. Space is an exciting way to get knowledge, but alas, most people are not motivated to get knowledge in the same way as they are to, say, have superiority over the Soviet Union. So although science continues to be an important motivating factor, I would consider it a weak motivation. And not to cast aspersions against science and knowledge, but I'm saying just from the point of view of almost propaganda, it's very hard to motivate people when you're appealing to their interest in, don't you want more scientific knowledge? NASA has tried over the years to say, well, hey, you know, something that we discovered in space can help us here. But for the most part, that has not ignited any real passion for space. More recently, there's been a third motive, the commercial motive. Everybody wants to make a buck. Money is good. I certainly think money is good. And the commercial motive has had some success. Unfortunately, the SpaceX program has had mixed success, but it's had some success. Richard Branson, billionaires have put some money into these programs. But nonetheless, I don't see a fleet of ships going out beyond the solar system. I don't see any attempt at interstellar travel at all. You know, there's a lot of interesting speculation. Stephen Hawking has suggested with other people maybe we should send little chips from here to the Alpha Centauri system. That's a good idea, but what about people? And so, having thought about this for a while, I finally wrote something about it in 2002, a book called Real Space, on the fate of physical presence in the digital age on and off planet. And what's most pertinent to what we're talking about here is the off-planet part of it. And I think that, you know, with all due respects to robots, one of the chapters in that book was entitled, Real Robots Don't Cry. We need people out there. We need the poetry of people. But thinking about this more, I realized that there was a very big and almost totally unexplored and untapped realm, which in many ways might provide the best motivation for getting off this planet and getting out there into the cosmos. I think it's the motivation that every sentient being has. Every person, and for all I know, dolphins, but we can't communicate with them all that well. But certainly every human being has wondered many, many times, what am I doing here in this world? What are we doing here? You look up at the sky, you see the stars. What's the meaning of all this? And science tries in its way to give us some answers, but science doesn't even begin to scratch the deepest parts of that question. And that brings me eventually to what we're talking about on this panel. Because there has been a mode of human discourse, a mode of human community, a mode of human cognition, as old, as far as we know, as the human species itself, which does address those issues. And that is religion, organized religion and unorganized religion. Now, religion has received, a sometimes justified, sometimes not justified rap as being opposed to science and knowledge. Certainly, the Catholic Church didn't help much when they persecuted Galileo, but they did apologize a couple of years ago. Better late than never. But that doesn't really matter, because it doesn't matter what religion has done wrong. What matters is what religion has done right, which is to address this issue in its own flawed way, because all human endeavors are flawed. And so I realize that religion may be the missing necessary engine for space travel. And I gave a talk like this, much like this, a few years ago, and also sitting at the table with me is Micheal, and was Micheal, you'll hear from him soon. And we began talking after that panel, and we began saying, hey, we should take this idea of the interrelationship of space travel and religion a little further than just talking about it at conferences. And so that's how this book, Touching the Face of the Cosmos, on the intersection of space travel and religion, was born. And, we did it the way I, and it turns out Micheal, do most things, by the seats of our pants. And I basically thought early on, hey, in addition to having essays, why not have some science fiction stories in there? And I was delighted to get actually a science fiction story from James, and an essay from my colleague at Fordham, Professor Strate, an essay from the Pope's astronomer, Guy Consolmagno, who also wants to apologize on behalf of Cardinal Bellarmine and all those people in the early 1600s. But he wrote a very good essay. I was able to interview John Glenn, who, by the way, is sharp as a whip. This was just this past July. And he had some interesting thoughts to say about this. So what I'm hoping will happen, and really the reason why I'm here, is to get more people to look into this avenue, because I truly believe that it doesn't even matter which religion it is. It can be any religion. It should be all religions. Again, it could be a non-organized religion. It could be a highly organized religion. But any part of human culture which is already looking at this fundamental question of who am I? What am I doing here? What is my relationship to the cosmos? That got Blaise Pascal to basically be in awe. I'm so tiny in relation to this immensity. Any part of human culture that looks at that is an intrinsic supporter, ally, and champion of space travel. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Levenson. Next up, I would like to introduce Lance Strate. He is a professor of communication and media studies at Fordham University. He is the founder and past president of the Media Ecology Association, past president of the New York State Communication Association, a trustee and former executive director of the Institute of General Semantics, current president of the New York Society for General Semantics, and president of the congregation Adas Emuno, a Reformed synagogue in Leonia, New Jersey. He is the author of several books, including On the Binding Biases of Time and Amazing Ourselves to Death, Neil Postman's Brave New World Revisited, and a poetry collection entitled Thunder at Darwin Station. Welcome, Dr. Strate.
Thank you. Well, when Paul asked me to contribute to the anthology, I was very intrigued because I'm a lot younger than Paul.
I'm about 28, so.
And I was born just a few weeks before Sputnik was launched. So probably like a lot of Americans, I was crying when it circled overhead, but for different reasons. But I did grow up with the space program and with Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek as very much a sense of the kind of future to aspire to. So when I thought about this, the question I kind of wanted to pose, and I said I'm going to be a little contrarian here, is why? That it just seems like we want to go out into space, but why is it? What is it that's driving us to do this? What is it that's moving us? And thinking about it, we look up, and maybe it's because we came down from the trees, but the idea of trees as sacred, mountains as sacred, the sky as sacred. I mean, we keep looking up to find something beyond ourselves. And when you look at the ancients, they looked up at the sun and the moon and the stars and thought of them as celestial beings, as gods. And certainly in a more practical sense, this was essentially time. And that this was the one thing you could count on, because seasons shift, they're unpredictable, but the movement of the heavens had a kind of regularity to it. I also thought it was kind of interesting, and going back to the 12th century, the philosopher Moses Maimonides was trying to reconcile Aristotelian learning with the Jewish tradition of the Torah and Talmud, and came up with this sense that the planets are somehow intermediate between the angels and beings on earth. There's kind of a position in between in a hierarchy. But I mean, all of this seems to suggest that we're trying to look for something beyond ourselves. I do think it's very interesting to consider the idea of the cosmos as a clockwork. I mean, this was the metaphor that was driving in the Enlightenment for Isaac Newton. And we say, what time is it? We also say, what time of day? And that is kind of interesting. I particularly take note that in June of 2015, we reset our coordinated universal time. We added a leap second to make sure that our measure of time, and our atomic clocks are more precise than anything, but they were falling out of sync with the Earth's rotation. Right? What we consider to be real is the Earth's rotation, not the more precise time of our atomic clocks. So I think time is our most essential environment, our invisible environment. Think about then, what are we trying to reach up there? When we look up into the sky, what is it that we see? And it also seems like there are two skies, really. Right? There's the daytime sky and the nighttime sky, and they in fact are very different. The daytime sky is very friendly. We even have, talk about blue skies are shining on me, where the night is dark and full of terrors. If you watch Game of Thrones, the nighttime sky is, in a sense, far away, where the daytime sky is close by. The nighttime sky is transcendent, where the daytime sky is immanent, and we're looking for this kind sense of transcendence in looking up to the nighttime sky and trying to kind of find that, pass through that interface to something else. And that leads me to ask, is that what what is it we're looking for? We're trying to find some kind of transcendence beyond the earthly sphere, but will we find it out there? That is this something that we can find through space travel? I mean, this is the question that I have to ask myself. You know, and my heart says yes, but I don't think I can justify it rationally. I can only justify it in emotional terms. And to give you the opposite point of view, and this is not what you want to hear, but sometimes it's good to look at the other point of view. And Lewis Mumford, who was one of the leading intellectuals of the 20th century, was actually a harsh critic of the space program. And he said, look, back in ancient Egypt, all these people were enslaved and put to work to build the pyramids, which were thought to send a select few, the Pharaoh and his people, to their concept of heaven. And that the space program is the same thing. It is channeling all these resources and labor to send a few people up to our conception of the heavens. And I'll read to you a little bit from what Mumford wrote in 1970. Again, I'm not going to like this, but it's, you know, thinking about what is the reason for doing this, and really trying to understand. And you know, if we all agree that we should be doing this, well, why are we doing this? So he writes concerning space exploration and the moon landing. By now, this exploration has reached a natural terminus. The last frontier is closed. The landing of the first 2 astronauts on the moon was not the beginning of a new age of cosmic exploration, but the end. The scientific technological revolution that began in the 16th century therewith reached its appropriate sterile terminus. A satellite as uninhabitable as the Earth itself will all too soon become. He's writing in 1970, mind you. Unless by a massive expenditure of imagination and courageous political effort, the peoples of the world challenge the age-old power complex. Without a counter-movement to slow down or reverse these automatic processes, mankind comes closer year by year to what is, in more than one sense, a dead end. Now, I mean, part of this is that he's looking at the space program in the context of the military, in the context of the Cold War, where it's all about beating the Russians, and also almost as a kind of propaganda effort for American superiority. So I just want to bring that up, and you know, with that, the question, what is it that we're doing? There's a meme that goes around, I've seen on the internet, that says there is no planet B, right? A play on Plan B. And it is that we can't sacrifice our own planet for the sake of going to the stars. So again, the question, you know, for me is, why are we doing this and what are we looking for? And I think we need to really search and come up with the answer. I'm not sure that transcendence is what we're going to find out there. I think that the pathway to transcendence perhaps comes from within rather than from without. So knowing that this is something that we want to do, that we have this drive to get out there, why? What is it that we're looking for? And I think that's a question worth answering. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Micheal Waltemathe. Did I pronounce that correct, I hope? Senior lecturer in the Department of Protestant Theology at Ruhr-University, Bochum in Germany. He works in the field of practical theology and religious education. He also serves as an officer of the Astro-Sociology Research Institute, a nonprofit educational organization dedicated to the development of astrosociology as a multidisciplinary academic field. In addition to the anthology Touching the Face of the Cosmos on the intersection of spaceflight and religion, which he co-edited with Paul Levinson, his publications include a monograph on computer games and religion, and several articles on spaceflight and religion, media and religious education. Micheal's academic interests include the relationship between human space exploration and religion, connections between media, art, and religion, and the science-religion debate and its place in religious education. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be on a panel with another theologian. Usually I'm the only guy in the room at a space conference. And also, we already managed to get the title of the book out there a couple of times, so mission accomplished. Is anyone from England in the room? On behalf of what Paul said, I'm sorry for hitting London when we aimed for the stars, right? So, Paul already mentioned that. We were at a panel in Brooklyn, a couple of years ago, and we're supposed to talk about pragmatic ways of finding the future from our specific fields. And I was representing religion and theology, and I think the reason we actually edited the book together was that I was pretty open about the fact that I couldn't give any pragmatic hints for finding your personal future. So that is something I'm going to talk about right now when I'm talking about space exploration. The way I understood this panel is that we are looking at ways to think about space exploration, human space exploration and religion that will give a connection between ethics, theology, and maybe personal faith and, what's the word? The German is missing an English word. Purpose for space exploration. So when you look at the literature, Frank White wrote the book called The Overview Effect, right? There is something that astronauts experience when they see the Earth as a whole. Literally, they see spaceship Earth. And this has been in what you just talked about quite a bit, that we are on a planet, there is no planet B, this is our spaceship Earth, and the way I understood it, maybe we should become the crew of spaceship Earth. What does it mean to be a crew? Can you even compare being a crew on a ship to living on a planet with, how many are we, 11 billion? 8 billion? 8 billion, right? 7.2. Yeah, let's make that 8. We're going to be 8 billion in a couple of years. With 8 billion people, I don't think you can compare that. But what you can learn from the overview effect is that there is actually something that binds us together, and also something that gives somebody who looks at it from the outside, literally, a transcendent perspective. This guy or this person is out of this world. They are looking at it from the outside. And that's the point of view that religion naturally gave people. They try to understand the way a higher being would look at them and thus gain knowledge from the outside. And that could be something that actually could motivate for space exploration. At least it has motivated some of the astronauts. You've read books by people who have probably have read books by people who have become religious, or at least spiritual, from going into space. People who state that their personal religion has been strengthened by going into space. And I think this is a strong motivating factor. And take that and go one step further. What happens if we become a multi-planet species? What happens if we have the perspective of living on multiple celestial bodies and maybe looking back at Earth from out there? Then Earth is the cradle from which we emerged. And it will always give Earth a certain specific, special place, but there will be other places that have their own specialties. When we talk about religion and space exploration at this time, and I've already talked about that yesterday in the track, there is also religious opposition to space exploration. And Lance has just given an example that was there. Religious opposition to space exploration in the 70s was basically what you just said. There is ecological reasons, there's sort of the end of an era, and if Earth doesn't want to, we don't want Earth to become as barren as the moon. We should put our money elsewhere, basically. Nowadays, the religious opposition is different. It is certain groups that say we shouldn't go out into space because we have been created, made to live on this planet, and it's not our place out there in the universe. And I would oppose that and say that is just not true. Theologically speaking, there is no reason to assume why we have only been made to live on Earth. If the whole universe has been created by a divine being, and this divine being is responsible for us too, then there is no reason to assume that we shouldn't learn more about this divine being by going out into the universe, which I think is one of the strongest motivations for space exploration. And as you related to the 12th century, if you go back to the 17th and 18th century during Enlightenment times, Enlightenment theology had this notion embedded within it very strongly, that you could actually go outside into the universe, look at nature, look at creation, and learn something about the Creator. So that, I think, is a strong theological motivation for actually doing space exploration. But it also poses, space exploration also poses the question of finding our place in the universe. And I know that you at the Mars Society already had this discussion about finding other life and re-evaluating the value of human life versus other life. What do we do if we find life on Mars? How do we deal with that? Do we help them along? Do we kill them off? Do we freeze them? And I'm just putting that out in a very gentle way, right? And I think you could actually understand that as as something that we have to do. From a religious point of view, we have been given stewardship of this planet, of this universe. And if we find life out there, is it not ours to help them along? And the question there is, and this is brilliant, okay, I'm the theologian, I can say, yeah, it's our duty to help them along. But how do we do that? Without understanding what this different form of life might be like, what their future is like, we cannot possibly think about how can we help them along. So this is a serious problem. I think there is some religious questions that we will need to answer. We will basically need to re-evaluate all our values and ethics that we have on this planet when we go to other planets. And I think that is one of the reasons why there is religious opposition to space exploration in the first place. It's sort of not the fear of the unknown, but it's the idea that you can't even cope with what you don't know about that. And again, I'll say that and then I'll stop. Personally, I do think that this notion that we had during Enlightenment times, that there is something to know about the universe, some unknown that was given to us to explore and better understand not only the universe or the physical laws, but our own place within it, and through that, the way we have been made, and through that, the nature of that divine being that some of us believe is behind that. I think that is the strongest religious motivation you can have for space exploration, and I would propose that we just do that. So, after a very brief talk, thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Now I'll pose a few questions to the panel, and sometimes I'll pose one to a specific gentleman, and others it'll be more general, and you can jump in as you wish. Dr. Levenson, with your background, how would you reveal a discovery of life on Mars to the public, whether it be microbial or even, kittens or something?
Well, actually, yeah, what Lance said is right. The first thing I would do is tweet it, because basically Twitter has toppled television as the cutting-edge medium for reporting on most live events. Not all live events. The Super Bowl still gets 115 million people. I expect the debate on Monday night to do almost as well as that. But for most other things, social media have replaced television. And the reason is that everyone participates in social media. Unlike television, which is fundamentally, always has been, still is, a one-way medium. So we get what television shows us, but the most we can do in response to that is talk to someone who's next to us. That's fine. But on Twitter and social media in in general, you see something, you read something, you hear something, and you can comment on it. When you retweet something, you can put your comment on it. So I'm actually serious about this. If I found out from somebody and nobody else knew that we had discovered life on Mars, I would tweet it. And hopefully I would get millions of more followers, which would be nice too.
Thank you. Dr. Waltemathe, what are the psychological implications of a mission of this duration, a mission to Mars, considering the isolation and boredom, possibly, that the astronauts will endure?
I don't know, but you see, for centuries, basically, religious people have sequestered themselves, went into isolation, and actually, tomorrow I'm going to talk about space architecture and religious architecture, and Carthusian monks, for instance, the architecture of the Carthusian monasteries, the architectural equivalent of single-family homes with a church and a support structure attached to it. The theological idea behind that was that these people were on their own, in their own little room, in their own little row house, basically, to get a greater connection to transcendence. And maybe we should look at it the other way and say, hey, that would be a great idea to actually get that connection. But when you look at, for instance, your Mars Desert Research Station or other Mars analogs on Earth, the communal space plays a very, very important role. So I think it's not only this single organism, single person lifestyle with the connection to transcendence, it's also the communal aspect that is always in there. And you won't go to Mars alone, right? Because only if you have a pretty good Twitter connection, then you could do that.
Thank
If
you.
you're using my system, you wouldn't get anything.
And if I might just build on his point, we can see a good historical point of comparison, for example, in the way the Irish monastics would hurl themselves into the sea with the hide-covered curragh, the one-man boats. And this was not seen, certainly not as something which was suicidal or anything. They trusted their fate into the hands of God, and showed up in the Shetland Islands, showed up in Iceland, and in point of fact, you actually had monastic communities that would then develop out of those who ended up in the same place solitarily. And when the Norse showed up in Iceland a number of decades later, they picked up and left from there. Didn't apparently like where the neighborhood was going. But that sense of isolation for contemplation, but also then community as church, these weren't seen as something which were points in contradiction with one another, but there was also not this terror at the idea of exploring their faith on an isolated basis.
Let me just add something here. Neil Postman, who was actually both Lance's and my professor at New York University, he was not an advocate of space exploration. He actually went full throttle along with Mumford. And he once said to me, what are we going to find when we get out there? There's nothing there. It's just all vacuum. You know, how are we going to breathe and so on? And that is a significant difference between all earth-bound explorations where you can just sort of throw yourself on a boat, and if the tides are right and the boat is well constructed, you could wash up somewhere and live. Because first of all, there'd be oxygen there, and if you were lucky, there might be some fish and so forth. So unfortunately about space, we do have to do more. We can't do it as incidentally as some of our explorations here on Earth have been. We have to prepare more. We have to get there in something that we can live on if the environment is not hospitable.
You know, just to throw out a few things since we're doing this, I wanted to just note, for one, that Mumford's objection was not a religious objection. In fact, Mumford was an atheist and was criticizing the use of religion in this instance, going back to the time of the pharaohs, to manipulate people to exert power over people. So, which is not, I mean, I'm certainly with you guys in the sense that this is, I don't take that point of view that religion is evil and it's all about manipulating people, but what we know is that it's something that has been used for good and for bad ends, and we have to look at that element as well. I did want to note that Wernher von Braun, who was the great pioneer of the V2 rocket, and then when we came to occupy Germany, we captured him. That was the big thing, right? The U.S. and the Soviets were both capturing German rocket scientists, and he became the head of our space program. And he said the same thing, that by getting out into getting a better look at creation, we will have a better idea of the Creator. So, and this keeps resonating, but I certainly don't see the religious objection. I mean, I think I agree that the religious point of view, by and large, is to take a better look at things. Also note the monasteries where the clocks were invented. The first mechanical clocks came from the medieval monasteries, but it was to control people's actions, to get the monks to prayer, to their appointed prayer hours on time.
Thank you. As was mentioned earlier, one of the gentlemen mentioned people who studied science often mention that it strengthened their faith. That's the case for me personally. And I would like to mention that, as you know, there's a broad spectrum of very fundamental versus progressive religions. There are people who are non-believers. And what possible, this is for anyone to jump in, what possible positive or negative effects could a Mars mission have on society and people of faith, whether they're fundamental or progressive or non-believers?
Because connected to that, and what I forgot to say was that one of the objections from a fundamental or a strong religious point of view is how do you do religious observance? And that's where, the wonderful, Paul's wonderful contribution coming from Borrowed Tides is about a Passover Seder during a space travel. But that's, the fundamental problem is that if you're supposed to observe certain religious holidays, if you're supposed to observe the Sabbath, they are very much about kind of earthly observations of day and night and what day of the year it is, and so forth. The Vatican does its own calculations for Easter. How do we do that? How do we, in a sense, perform our religion if we're out in space where all of those indicators are no longer valid? I think that's a very interesting question to consider for the future of space exploration.
Well, that has actually, and that's why I was so surprised to find religious opposition to space exploration, because that has basically all been discussed. There is an Institute of Space Halakha that was founded after Ilan Rahman was named an astronaut on the Columbia mission. There is a fatwa out by a Malaysian Muslim authority that actually describes how you can perform Muslim ritual on the International Space Station. So all this has been thought through for low Earth orbit and the sphere of influence of the Earth. I think the reason why there was religious opposition is that there were missions being proposed that would go outside the sphere of Earth's influence. And the thing about that is that when you look at that basically boils down to the one question for me: who or what religious institution will want to be part of such a mission? And so this is just, I'm flying on the seats of my pants here, right?
It would be Scientology, wouldn't it?
I would think the more, well, either you have that already in your religion, like the Church of the Latter-day Saints or Scientology has, you would want to go. Or the more liberal you are, the more you would want to go. But once you've established an outpost, once you've gone from a vetted community of astronauts to tourism, settlers, and so on and so forth, I think they would all want to come. When the thing is, especially the more fundamental ones. But where is that pivotal point, right? That would be interesting to think more about.
And if I might.
A couple of quick things. One is, I think religions traditionally here on earth, especially the oldest religions, have spent an enormous amount of time trying to preserve their rituals and their ways of doing things, which makes sense because we live in a very chaotic world, and if you don't preserve the tradition, it can easily dissipate. I think going out into space will reverse that. There's nothing out in space itself to attack traditions. So therefore, religions don't need to spend that much time saying, well, you know, you have to bow to Mecca X number of times a day, but where is Mecca if I'm on Mars? It doesn't matter. I think that the most clear-thinking exponents of all the major religions, when they get to Mars, will see that these rituals that were necessary here over the millennia on planet Earth are not that necessary out in space. And religion can then get down to what I was saying before, exploring the basis of what the religion is, which is, what are we doing here in this universe? And just one other quick point, a two-part point. A student of mine at Fordham about 10 years ago, Frank Borziarelli, wrote a master's thesis and actually did some research, I think on SurveyMonkey or whatever the equivalent was, basically trying to find out which religions were most in favor of space travel and which religions weren't, which believed in Roswell. And yeah, and he found that evangelists were the most likely to believe that aliens had come to Roswell.
Well, it's demons, right?
Yeah. So,
Well, and again, building on some of these points we've been discussing, going back to the issue of the dates for observances and so forth, often within the tradition, these matters have already been addressed. The dating of Easter, which is the central point in the entire Christian liturgical calendar, already by the earliest ecumenical councils, you had a discrepancy between the Eastern or Greek observance and the Western Latin observance. And I believe it was as early as the First Nicene Council, there was the agreement of difference in the dating was not divisive of fellowship. And so this was important because they understood there was a unity in that which was taught, and these matters of practice and observance could vary. At the same time, the usual perceived tripping points, at least as set forth by non-theists, for example, the discovery of life elsewhere, something that Nicole and I were talking about yesterday, was already within, just to speak to my own tradition, Kepler, who was a confessional Lutheran by way of his theology, he was speculating in his own writings about what type of life we would expect to find according to the world in which it was located. And so he goes on to have speculations about, well, what should Jovian life be like? What should lunar life be like? They were operating from the assumption already in the 1600s, well, obviously God would have created life on other worlds. And so that theological trip point isn't the problem. The practical ones of religious observance don't have to be a difficulty. It's rather a matter of becoming more aware for those who are religious of the way in which these matters have been addressed within our various traditions to then apply them to the developing circumstances. So.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. We've reached our hour point, and I'm sure everyone is hungry and ready for lunch. And if you would like to stick around afterwards, maybe in the hallway or in the back of the room or up at the panel.
And in that regard, there is a table out in the entryway where we would be available. All of us are contributors to that, touching the Face of the Cosmos volume.
Okay.
If there are those who wish to get copies, those are available.
Okay, gentlemen will be available for questions at the table outside. Thank you.
thank you.